Hey there, welcome to Bookends. I'm Mattea Roach. Kyle Edwards grew up loving hockey, but he also saw how complicated it could be for Indigenous players, and he explores that tension in his debut novel, Small Ceremonies. Set in Winnipeg, the story follows a group of Ojibwe teens. They're chasing their hockey dreams and coming of age in a game and a place that can be both beautiful and brutal. But for Kyle, hockey isn't just a game. It's a mirror, a battleground, and sometimes even a ceremony of its own. Kyle Edwards grew up on the Lake Manitoba First Nation in Manitoba, and he's a member of the Ebb and Flow First Nation. He now lives in Los Angeles, California, which is where I reached him for this conversation. Hi, Kyle. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Your novel, Small Ceremonies, centers around this high school hockey team called the Tigers and their families and wider community. And of course, really dives into the players who are all Indigenous, and you bring to life how much this game means for all of the characters. What kind of a pull does hockey have on you personally?
I think it was probably like my first dream as a kid, other than being a writer. I wanted to be a hockey player. I was like, okay, when I was growing up, I want to like go to the NHL and do that stuff. That did not happen. But I loved it. I loved playing the game growing up. And I think I always had this sort of conflicting relationship with it, just in terms of the different types of violence that are associated with it. Mostly on the ice. I think it was where I like experienced sort of violence for the first time, both physical and like sort of verbal. But I love the game. I think it's very beautiful and poetic, and I love how much it means to Canadians and Indigenous people. I think, it holds its hold on such a pedestal that I felt like I really wanted to write about it in this book.
Can you talk a bit about that tension, though? Because you're talking about the sort of violence in it, that it was one of the first spaces where you maybe experienced certain kinds of violence, and that it has a specific meaning maybe for Indigenous Canadians. What was it like engaging in hockey as an Indigenous person growing up?
Yeah, I think it was difficult. I grew up in a res, so you're constantly playing teams from small towns, and there's this sort of racial aspect to it. You know, the team from the res and the team from this small, probably mostly white town, and just the history of violence that is Canada. I think it just sort of creates this arena for different tensions and histories that sort of play out on the ice. And that was difficult as a child. There was a time where I like didn't want to be associated with it, but Native people in Canada, Indigenous people in Canada, we just love this game so much. It's really beautiful to see. It brings us together all over the country. There's, Indigenous only tournaments all over Canada. And I think we just sort of, fight through that. Hockey is known for being such an exclusive sport, right? Like it's very exclusive to people who can afford it, people who are of a certain social class. Indigenous people aren't often seen as part of that, but we really don't care in a lot of ways. I haven't been to a res in Manitoba that doesn't have its own hockey rink, and hockey rink aren't they're not cheap. So
they're not cheap to maintain. Yeah, you got to put real work into keeping that place up.
Yeah, exactly.
The characters in this novel actually name check certain Indigenous players. They talk about Jordan Tootoo very early on as someone who's important to them. What is the significance of somebody like Jordan Tootoo and other Indigenous hockey players like him?
When I was growing up, he was a huge deal. I got to meet him and his brother at a Jordan Tootoo hockey camp in Winnipeg when I was really young. And I have like photos with him when I was like really small. And yeah, it was such a cool experience. They were so nice. But obviously we knew him because he was such a tough guy on the ice, as were a lot of like Indigenous players, Theon Fleury and Jonathan Chichu. Like they were all just like really tough, and we all kind of wanted to be like them. We wanted to fight like them. We wanted to be tough like them. And whenever they were fighting other people, it felt like they were fighting for us, you know, because hockey it's such a complicated game in terms of, you know, Canadian nationalism, I guess, you know, in terms of what it means to be Canadian. It's such a huge part of the identity of so many people. And so, yeah, we really looked up to those players who we felt like were pushing back on that grain.
In your novel, Small Ceremonies, there's this sense that like other teams in the league around the Tigers, which is the team that we're following, this team full of Indigenous kids, kind of view them as like possibly too violent, don't want to play against them. Oh, we don't want to, you know, drive 20 minutes up the road or whatever to go play against them. There's a lot of like physical and emotional violence as well. What is the kind of relationship between passion and violence that you wanted to explore in your novel?
I think that, you know, passion and violence can be kind of closely related and hard to distinguish in this game. So yeah, the Tigers follows this team that's sort of being thrown out of the league, right? Because they're being perceived as too violent. But one of like my biggest concerns writing the book was like, okay, people are going to think this is like just unrealistic, that this could never happen in Canada. It has happened. And like, this was probably the journalist part of me that it's not like directly based on this, but like around the time that I was going into university in 2017, there was this like really good junior hockey team from the Peguis First Nation in Manitoba. And they were like really good. They went on like just one of the craziest winning streaks that their league at the time had ever seen. And they ended up, you know, going on to win the championship. And I played in that league. It was a junior league. And the very next season, all of the junior teams from like small white towns voted to separate from all of the teams that were based on First Nations, including Peguis, who had won the championship, to create their own league because they didn't want to travel to these teams anymore. And this was only like a few years ago. This has all happened before I even started writing the novel. And I remember reading that and I was like, wow, that's like just so typical. And you probably shouldn't expect that sort of thing. I wanted to evoke that same sort of shock in this story because I feel like there's going to be a lot of people reading this, a lot of Canadians in particular, who would think like this is a type of story that would never happen, but it happens all over the country and it happened not too long ago.
There's this very idealistic way that we can think of sport as like sport is the great equalizer. You know, this is the like Olympic ideal, right? We all can go and be equal on the field or be equal on the ice. But then in practice, you do see in any sort of recreational sports league, these tensions that emerge between different groups, whether it's class-based, whether it's racial. Like, why is it that people want to put up these barriers and be exclusionary still, do you think, in sport?
That's such an interesting question, you know, like, I mean, sports has always had this sort of like segregational thing to it, right? But I think there is just a hierarchy in sport in the same way there is in sort of like the world. And I think a lot of times sports is sort of like a reflection, like you said, a mirror of the real world. And I think we try to tell ourselves and hide it. You know, there's a line I really like in the book where I say something along the lines of, you know, hockey is an arena, an illusion of what Canadians like to tell themselves. And I think that's fairly accurate. You know, we like to tell ourselves that if you watch the playoffs in Canada right now, you're going to see tons of different commercials that are trying to tell you that hockey is a game for everyone. and they're just like nonstop. They're relentless. But the reality is that's not really true. And it hasn't been true for an incredibly long time.
Kyle, I want to talk about the specific time period that you set this book in, around 2010, 2011. These players are Ojibwe high schoolers. They're almost ready to graduate. What is it about this particular time that you wanted to dive into?
I really like that time period because it was around the time Idle No More started in Canada, and there were protests and round dances and marches, things happening all over the country. There was this sort of like reckoning about Canada's history with Indigenous peoples and its violent history and the genocide that had happened and was ongoing all throughout Canada. And so I just thought that was a really interesting time. And it was a really interesting time in my life. I had just graduated high school around that time, and those drums, those marches, those shouts from the streets, just everywhere, especially in Winnipeg. I was living in Winnipeg at the time, finishing high school. And, you know, people were outside in minus 40 protesting on the street. And it was just like this really powerful moment in my life where I sort of was made more aware of the world around me and my place in it. And also it was just like a time where I became more political. And I think I wanted that experience for the characters in this book who perhaps grew up a little bit sheltered. And I think education is such a big part of this book. And they, you know, have lived an experience so far where they haven't really learned a lot about their own history. It's one of the few aspects of the book that I think is pulled from my own experience, where that was a time in my life that really changed me. And I felt like it was a really interesting time to be a young person. And I thought, why not write about it too?
Winnipeg is featured so prominently in your novel, it's almost like it's another character. How has Winnipeg shaped you? Because I know you're living in the States now, but you so clearly have this love for and relationship with Winnipeg that's ongoing.
I enjoyed, you know, introducing people to Winnipeg and sort of situating it in their mind, because I think it's a city that is overlooked in a lot of ways, but like it is like a really interesting place. It's the political and cultural epicenter for Indigenous people in Canada. There's almost 100,000 Native people there.
Of Canada's big cities.
Yeah.
I think it is the most Indigenous, certainly more than like Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, Vancouver.
Yeah, there are like huge tracts of Winnipeg that have been given back to particular First Nations. Like there are legitimate like urban reses like within the city. And yeah, I moved to Winnipeg when I was a teenager. I lived there for a long time. A lot of my family still, like, you know, my mom and brothers and aunties, uncles, grandparents, they all live in Winnipeg now. So yeah, whenever I go back home, I'm usually going to Winnipeg and then probably making a trip out to Lake Manitoba First Nation. I've been living in the States for 6 years now. And I think writing about a place when you haven't been there in a while is really interesting. And it's sort of, I don't know, it gives you this weird distance to be able to think about it differently and appreciate it differently.
What's your favorite thing about Winnipeg, would you say?
Honestly, I really like how cold it gets. I like the snow. I love going back during the winter, and I love being able to just like immediately leave the city and see that, you know, how beautiful it is. It's just like flat, snowy tundra. It's very beautiful. And what I love about just home in general is just how close my res is from Winnipeg. They're so close together. It's like only like a 2-hour drive. It's very pretty.
I think there's something about driving between two places that are important to you that's also like, I definitely feel that. I connect with that. I think a lot about like the drive from Halifax to up where my mom grew up in Cape Breton.
Yeah.
And that drive to me is like no drive can compare. But it makes sense to me that you would feel that way about your own home.
Yeah. And I love driving through Winnipeg too. I mean, I've lived in a few cities since moving away from Winnipeg. I lived in Toronto and New York, and now I'm in California. But Winnipeg's so far the only city in my life where I can just like go there and drive around and know exactly where I am. And I could drive to the end of the city, get back to my mom's house. Like it's just, I know everything about it. Yeah, I can't say the same about any other place I've lived in. And maybe that's just because Winnipeg's a bit smaller, but yeah, it's pleasant.
Kyle, I want to return actually to the title of your novel. And the title of the book is Small Ceremonies. What does ceremony mean to you and to the characters in the book?
Ceremonies, for me, I mean, they could be anything. Things that get you through the day. I think definitely hockey is one of those ceremonies. I mean, there's so many characters in the book that have like little things that they sort of cling on to on a daily basis that sort of help them just survive in a way. And yeah, we think of ceremonies as these huge things, but I think they can be quite small. And hockey is a sort of ceremony in a way. It brings us together in the same way that powwows and sundances do, and other different, ceremonial things within Indigenous cultures. But there is this sort of chorus of characters, and each of them, I hope, has like their time to shine in the book. But they also have like very distinct things that they do, like different practices and rituals that I think are just so unique to them.
I think you've described before the idea of ceremony. It's something that can bring you closer to yourself. And I feel like that's definitely something we see different characters pick up in different ways throughout the novel. Small Ceremonies as a book explores a lot of different kinds of family bond. There's blood relationships that are explored. You just mentioned a relationship between brothers. There's parent-child relationships, grandparents, aunts, all sorts of things. Also found families. But in terms of your own family, you dedicated this book to your mom. What does your family think of this novel?
They are very proud of me, of course. My mom was a single mom, so she had a lot of help from like her siblings and her own parents raising me as a young kid. They had such a huge role in my life. And, whenever they're in a bookstore and they see the book on the shelf, they're always taking photos and being like, hey, look what I saw in the bookstore. And yes, I was like, yeah, I know. My brother, who's 4 years younger than me, when the book came out, I think he went into a Chapters Indigo, and he went and like completely bought like all the copies that were available on the shelf. And he took a photo of this huge stack of books in the back seat of his car. And but then he said in his text to me, he was like, I want a cut of the royalties. And I was like, dude, I don't think you know how that works. That's like $5.
Yeah, he thinks you're making big money doing book publishing. Yeah. That's sweet though. Yeah, he was buying out all the books and then trying to resell them, give them out to people. What was his plan with the backseat full of books?
Oh, I think he just gave them away to it was during his like lunch break, and he went back to his office and just gave them away to his coworkers.
Well, that's sweet. That's really sweet. Kyle, thanks so much for chatting with me today. It's been such a joy diving into the world of hockey with you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Kyle Edwards is the author of Small Ceremonies. He joined me from his home in Los Angeles. This episode was produced by Lisa Matthews with help from Katie Swales. Ailey Yamamoto is our associate producer. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. A big thank you to our audio tech, Aronde Williams, and to everyone on the CBC Books team. They are incredible people to work with. I am so lucky. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. If you just absolutely love the sound of my voice, why stop listening now? You can check out the Bookends archive of interviews on the podcast app of your choice. And don't forget to follow us and share the show with a friend. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.